Tim, Diddy invited me to his birthday party, but he took me to a separate room where there were all young boys. Diddy forced me to sacrifice them. He also forced me to beat Casty.
It was a packed room. No cameras, no phones, just sharpened pencils, shuffling papers, and eyes that refused to blink. The judge had barely settled into his seat when the murmurs began. A case like this doesn't come along often, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Some were there for justice, others for spectacle, but all were there for one man, Shaw Diddy Combs. He sat at the defendant's table, immaculate in a dark navy suit, polished shoes that reflected the dim courtroom lights, and a stare that seemed both hollow and calculating. If the weight of decades in the spotlight was crushing him, he didn't show it. His lawyers flanked him, silent, strategic, and unreadable. The prosecution, however, carried the energy of someone ready to detonate a bomb. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor began. This case is not just about money. It's not just about influence. It's about power unchecked and what happens when the walls finally close in. Diddy didn't flinch, but in the jury box, you could see faces twitch, brows furrow, and posture shift. They were leaning in, and they had every reason to. What followed was the revelation that the court would hear testimony involving private meetings between Diddy and none other than Bishop T.D. Jake, spiritual counselor, spiritual cover. That was the question everyone suddenly wanted answered. The judge cleared his throat. "Let it be clear," he said. "Mention of religious figures will be treated with the utmost seriousness. No theatrics, no speculation. This is a court of law, but the courtroom was already a volcano. Courtroom artists scribbled furiously to capture the tension in graphite and ink. Reporters mouthed texts they weren't allowed to send. And then came the first real crack in the surface. A man stepped forward. Gray suit, buzzcut, trembling hands. He was Diddy's former head of security, assigned to him for 5 years. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Can you state your name for the record?" The prosecutor asked. "Malcolm Stokes," he said, barely above a whisper. "And what was your relationship to Mr. Combs?" "I kept him safe. I knew his schedule, who he saw, where he went, day and night. What unusual visits did you observe in the weeks leading up to Mr. Combs' arrest?" There was a pause so long it became physical. Everyone in the room leaned forward without realizing it. "He visited Bishop T.D. Jake." "Jake's," Malcolm said, his voice stronger now. "More than once. Late hours. No entourage. He went in alone and came out shaken. Real shaken. Did Mr. Combs ever indicate what those meetings were about?" Malcolm hesitated. His eyes scanned the courtroom, then settled on Diddy, who stared back, expression unreadable. "Once after a visit, he told me, if it all comes down, the bishop knows why." The air snapped. The jury's expressions morphed into disbelief. Someone in the back of the courtroom audibly exhaled. The judge banged his gavel once, sharp but not angry. "The gallery will remain silent." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Do you know what he meant by that?" "I didn't ask," Malcolm replied. "I didn't want to." "Did you inform anyone?" "No. Why not?" "Because I thought he was trying to change, that maybe he was making peace with something." And now Malcolm looked down. "Now, I don't know what to think." The courtroom was silent again, but this time it was the kind of silence that crept into your skin. Diddy turned to his lawyer, whispered something. His lawyer nodded. It was a small movement, but enough to make the jury notice. Everything was being watched now. Every blink, every twitch. The judge declared a short recess, but no one moved. For a moment, it felt like the walls of the courtroom were holding their breath, and outside, behind the stone pillars and police barricades, the world waited too. Find out what exactly the bishop knew and what Diddy had already confessed. When the court reconvened, the tension had calcified into something more permanent, like a fog no one could walk through without feeling it press against their skin. The judge entered swiftly, barely acknowledging the gallery. He knew the circus had begun, but it wasn't outside with the paparazzi or in the blogs dissecting courtroom sketches. It was right there in the testimonies, in the moments between questions. In the silence that lingered till long after an answer, all eyes turned to the witness box. The next man walking forward didn't need an introduction for anyone who had followed Diddy's career closely. Roland Maddox, longtime fixer, former security strategist, part spiritual buffer, part executive shield, a man whose job wasn't to make problems go away. It was to make sure they were never born. The prosecution didn't smile when they called him. They knew he was slippery, but they also knew one thing: he was done protecting anyone. Immunity makes people bold, Mr. Maddox, the prosecutor said, his tone crisp. You've submitted communications between Mr. Combs and several spiritual leaders, but we'd like to focus on one name in particular, Bishop T.D. Jake. Roland adjusted the mic. Yes, sir. I was involved in coordinating some of those meetings. How many times, to your knowledge, did Mr. Combs meet privately with Bishop Jake in the 3 months leading up to his arrest? Roland paused. At least 5. That I arranged personally. There may have been more. Described the tone of those meetings. A flicker of discomfort danced across Roland's face. Urgent. Confessional. I once heard Diddy say, if I can't buy silence, maybe I can buy salvation. I didn't understand it fully then. Now I do. The prosecutor walked slowly toward the jury, then turned back. Mr. Maddox, did you ever see Mr. Combs leave those meetings in an emotionally distressed state? Roland nodded. Every time, he wasn't the same man walking out that went in. One time, he just sat in the car for 20 minutes and said nothing, just stared. Was anything ever discussed about legal consequences during these meetings? I overheard one call on speaker. Accidentally, he told the bishop, they're closing in. If I fall, I'll fall on the truth. You were right. Then he hung up. The judge interjected. Let's be cautious with speculative context, Mr. Maddox. Yes, Your Honor, Roland said. The prosecutor leaned in. Mr. Maddox, did Mr. Combs ever request anything unusual involving Bishop Jake? Roland hesitated. Then, he wanted all recordings of their sessions destroyed, said they weren't safe, said even Heaven's Gate can be hacked. The courtroom went still again. Somewhere in the gallery, a pen dropped. The sound was thunderous. In the silence, and did you destroy them? Roland's mouth tightened. I couldn't. They were encrypted and backed up, but I didn't say that at the time. Where are they now? Roland looked toward the judge. With federal authorities under seal, a buzz shot through the air. The jury looked at one another, their expressions now hardening, not out of bias, but because they knew they were no longer watching a man being accused. They were witnessing a man unraveling through his own past. The defense rose for cross-examination, but didn't speak right away. Instead, Diddy's lead attorney, older, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, just looked at Roland. You were paid well, weren't you? Roland nodded. I was. You were trusted. I was. And now that you're not being charged, you suddenly remember everything perfectly. No, Roland said quietly. Now, I remember everything honestly. The judge called for a short adjournment, and again, no one moved, because inside that courtroom, the silence said more than anyone dared to speak aloud. If those recordings ever made it into the public eye, it wouldn't just be the story of a fallen mogul. It might be the beginning of an entirely new scandal, one that started in prayer but ended in betrayal. The courtroom was colder that morning, not because of the temperature, but because of what everyone now knew was possible. The name TD. Jake was no longer floating in the edges of gossip or sealed files. It was in the transcript, on the record, embedded in the minds of jurors and journalists alike. What had started as a celebrity legal drama was now morphing into something heavier, something spiritual, something shadowed. When the next witness was called, the tension wasn't just in the room. It was wrapped around every breath. She walked to the stand with a quiet strength, Naller, former producer, in her circle. One of the few people allowed in the room when Diddy spoke off record. She'd been invisible to the public, but essential. Behind the scenes, she knew where the switches were, and she knew when they were flipped. Miss Lair, the prosecutor said, "You're here under limited immunity. Are you prepared to speak honestly?" "Yes," she said finally. "You were part of a retreat in early March, correct? One hosted by Bishop T.D. Jake and attended by Mr. Combs." "Yes." "Can you describe the nature of that retreat?" She nodded, taking a breath. "It was built as spiritual healing, but for Diddy, it was something else. He called it a soft exit, like a pre-confession. He said if anything happened, at least the bishop would know his side. The jury was locked in. Every head pointed forward, every hand still. The phrase soft exit rang in the room like a warning no one had heard until it was too late. What happened during that retreat?" Na leaned in slightly. "Diddy spoke for hours? In front of the bishop, in front of all of us. He was vague, but the guilt was thick. He said he'd wronged people, lied to them, used them. He cried, and then he stopped. What do you mean? He cut the lights. Told us the only truth that mattered was the one that stayed off camera. That's when I knew, whatever this was, it was more than therapy. It was strategy. Was there any documentation of this retreat?" "Yes. A private scribe was hired to take notes. No phones allowed, but the notes were printed. Do you have a copy?" "I do." The prosecutor held up a sealed envelope. "We'd like to submit this as Exhibit 19. The defense jumped to their feet. "Objection. This violates privacy and spiritual confidentiality." The judge didn't blink. Overruled. If the defendant voluntarily shared confessions in a group, it's admissible. The envelope was passed to the clerk. You could hear the faint crackle of the paper inside, like a secret begging to be read. Then the prosecutor read a passage from the transcript. "I told the bishop everything. I asked him if grace had a limit. He said, God's grace doesn't, but man's law does. And that's when I knew I had to prepare for both." Irmer's in the gallery. The judge banged his gavel once, but it was too late. That line, "prepare for both," had already settled in everyone's bones. The prosecutor turned back to Nina. "Did Mr. Combs ever express fear, not of being caught, but of being known?" She nodded. "That was his biggest fear, not prison, exposure. He once said, if they know what I've done, even my legacy won't be worth remembering." Did you believe he was talking about criminal activity? I didn't want to, but yes. In hindsight, yes. "And why are you testifying now?" Na's voice cracked. "Because I was loyal to a man who stopped being loyal to the truth. And because someone in that room deserves to know they weren't crazy for feeling something dark in the middle of all that prayer." The defense didn't ask to cross-examine. Not that day. The judge adjourned the session, but no one stood up. The silence that followed Na off the stand wasn't the kind that fades when the door closes. It followed people into their cars, into their homes, into their thoughts that night. And outside the courthouse, people weren't asking if Diddy was guilty. They were asking what exactly he'd already confessed to, when no cameras were rolling, but the soul was fully exposed. By the time the courtroom filled that day, the energy had shifted from curiosity to obsession. This wasn't about fame anymore. It was about faith, secrets, and what happens when the two collide in front of the law. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder. Everyone wanted to hear what came next. The prosecution had made a bold move overnight. They issued a subpoena for one of Bishop T.D. Jake's sermons, specifically a private recording from a Sunday service held just a week after Diddy's final visit to him. It was never meant for public release. But now it was evidence. The judge called the court to order. No one was whispering. No one was blinking. The prosecution pressed play. The audio crackled to life. The deep, measured voice of Bishop Jake filled the room. Sometimes a man builds an empire from smoke and mirrors. And when the fire comes, he thinks it's an attack, but it's really the mirror shattering. In the courtroom, no one breathed. He came to me with trembling hands, told me he bought the silence of many, but never his own. I told him, grace will meet you at the gates, but not before truth walks you there. The audio paused. The prosecutor turned to the judge. This sermon, Your Honor, came after private meetings with the defendant. The defendant admits to attending the service. We ask the court to admit this as reflective of context. The defense shot up. Your Honor, this is a religious message. It's metaphor. It cannot be legally interpreted as testimony. The judge considered it. This court acknowledges the freedom of religious expression. However, when that expression becomes part of a public record, following private meetings under scrutiny, it becomes relevant. Objection overruled. Outside the courtroom, the media didn't wait. They published every word. Inside, the next witness was already approaching the stand. Patricia Garland, a spiritual advisor employed briefly by Combs's foundation. She had remained silent for 2 years, until today. Double quotes Ms. Garland. The prosecutor said, "You were employed during a time of spiritual transition for Mr. Combs." Yes, she said carefully. He was trying to reconcile two worlds. What do? You mean he'd built a life on power, that he was terrified of what came after? He once said, "I can face the feds, but I don't think I can face the Father." The jury didn't flinch. They'd learned to listen with more than their ears by now. Did he ever confess to any actions that could be considered illegal? Patricia hesitated, not directly, but he spoke about sacrifices he had made, things he buried, people he distanced. He said the bishop warned him that truth buried doesn't stay buried. Was there ever discussion about covering those truths? Yes, he said he'd paid people to forget, but some memories don't have a price tag. He was starting to believe that. The defense leaned forward, visibly frustrated, but they didn't object. Not yet. The prosecutor stepped closer. Was there ever mention of evidence? Of recordings? Documentation? Yes. He mentioned a safe. Said it held ghosts that don't speak, but scream if touched. I didn't know what he meant, but I knew he feared that safe more than any courtroom. And was Bishop Jake aware of this? I don't know. But the bishop told him one night after a session, if you lock truth in a box, it doesn't stay silent. It just waits. A wave of chills moved through the gallery like a silent storm. The prosecutor turned to the judge. We request access to that safe. The defense jumped up. This is outrageous. There is no proof that safe exists, let alone that it holds anything relevant. The judge raised a hand. The court will deliberate on that motion. For now, the testimony stands as Patricia left the stand. Her last glance at Diddy wasn't angry. It was mournful, like someone who'd watched a man burn down his own sanctuary and then begged the ashes for forgiveness. Court adjourned moments later, but no one moved for a while. They just sat there, surrounded by a sermon they weren't sure was meant for them, but felt like it was. Outside, crowds chanted, argued, prayed. Inside, the truth was circling tighter. And somewhere out there, that safe waited. No one expected the financial expert to carry the most emotional weight of the trial so far. But when Evan Marks, a forensic accountant with icy confidence and a memory like a machine, took the stand, something in the air turned sharper. The gallery didn't shift much. Numbers don't usually excite a courtroom, but this time, numbers had teeth. Evan had spent months combing through Diddy's empire, shell companies, overseas transfers, charitable foundations, and a string of donations that on paper looked generous. But generosity, he explained, is often a mask for precision. Mr. Marks, the prosecutor said, you've prepared a forensic trail of financial activity tied directly to the defendant's accounts. Is that correct? Yes, Evan replied. And what we found is a pattern, one that starts with spiritual charity and ends in strategic silence. The phrase hit the room like a small explosion. Explain. Evan gestured to a set of printed ledgers. 3 large donations were made from entities tied to Mr. Combs, each routed through intermediaries, each deposited into ministries or non-profit arms affiliated with Bishop T.D. Jake. The defense shot up. Are you accusing Bishop Jake of misconduct? No, Evans said flatly. I'm showing that the money moved in perfect timing with events in Mr. Combs' legal timeline. Every dollar had a shadow, he continued. On March 3rd, the day after an alleged confession during the spiritual retreat, a $750,000 donation was transferred to a media development fund registered in Dallas, Texas, tied to a pastoral media trust. And that same week, the prosecutor asked, Evan flipped pages. Mr. Combs met with 2 legal teams, one of which handles crisis media management. He also purchased a secondary encryption software to secure his home cloud server. The purchase was done through a third party and flagged by the financial compliance team. The numbers were adding up and the jury could feel it. These weren't mistakes, these were moves. Quiet, legal, but loaded with motive, Evan pressed on. The most unusual transfer came in April, $1.1 million labeled as a donation for kingdom expansion, but it didn't go to a church, it went to a real estate holding group affiliated with Bishop Jake's real estate arm. The courtroom stirred. It wasn't a direct accusation, but the implication hovered like smoke that refused to dissipate. Is there proof that this money was used to silence anyone? No direct proof. But we did uncover NDA settlements issued the same week. One of them tied to a former assistant who had begun leaking information about Mr. Combs' private spiritual sessions. The prosecutor nodded. So to summarize, you're saying that there's a web of financial transactions that coincide with moments of potential legal exposure for the defendant. Yes, think of it like this. Whenever truth threatened to knock, the money moved first. The judge ordered the documents to be reviewed in chambers. But the message was already out. As Evan left the stand, the defense finally acted. They called for a sidebar. They argued this wasn't financial evidence, it was narrative. But even the judge looked shaken. That afternoon, one final piece of evidence was submitted, a redacted transcript of a conversation between Diddy and his personal assistant, captured through a wiretap in an unrelated investigation. In it, Diddy said, if the donation's by piece, that's still spiritual currency, right? I mean, what's the difference? The difference was being debated in the courtroom that very minute. Outside, the story had fractured. Some defended him, said he was a man of faith trying to cleanse his soul. Others saw a manipulator using religion as insulation. But inside, it was harder to ignore the numbers. They didn't lie, they didn't exaggerate, they didn't need permission, they just told the truth. And that truth, brick by brick, was tearing down every wall Diddy had ever built to protect his image. By day 6, it wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a theater of revelation. Outside, the line to get in wrapped around the building. Inside, even the regulars clerks, court reporters, officers had stopped pretending this was a typical case. Everyone knew it was history, and it was about to get personal. The prosecutor called their next witness, and a ripple swept through the gallery. It was Jasmine Lane, an R&B artist once known for her close connection to Diddy. Not just professionally, but spiritually. They'd prayed together, recorded together, even spoke on panels about redemption in the entertainment industry. She hadn't been seen publicly since the indictment. Now here she was. No entourage, no makeup. Just the truth. Or at least her version of it. As she took the stand, Diddy looked up. For the first time all trial, he looked human, less composed, more wounded. Jasmine didn't look back. Miss Lane, the prosecutor began. Can you describe the last time you spoke to the defendant before his arrest? Jasmine took a breath. It was at a dinner. Not in public, just a few of us. He pulled me aside after dessert, said he needed prayer. What exactly did he say? He said, I feel it coming, and it's not a raid. It's a reckoning. The jury was still. Even the defense attorneys paused their note-taking. Did he elaborate? Jasmine nodded. He told me he'd spoken to Bishop Jake that week, that the bishop told him he needed to tell the truth before the world forced it out of him. Diddy said, I'm not afraid of jail. I'm afraid of silence. I've lived too long in noise. The prosecutor walked slowly across the floor, letting her words linger. Did he confess anything to you? There was a heavy pause. He didn't say specifics, but his eyes were wet, and he said, if I don't tell it, it'll be told for me. He asked me if I believed in grace. I said yes, and he said, then pray it comes before justice does. Did he ever mention any recordings? Yes, he said he left messages with the bishop, that they were encrypted. Said he wanted someone to hear his heart, even if the court never heard his voice. Was he fearful? No, not exactly. It was more like surrender. He knew it was over. He just didn't want to die without feeling heard by someone. The defense finally stood. Miss Lane, you're a performer, a storyteller. How can we trust that this isn't just a script? Jasmine turned her eyes toward him, unwavering. Because this time, I wasn't performing. He was. There was no rebuttal. No redirect. Next, the prosecution introduced a clip of a sermon, not from Bishop Jake, but from a guest speaker who had filled in for him one Sunday. The speaker spoke of a leader whose wealth could move mountains, but who now sought refuge at the altar of repentance. The courtroom listened in silence. Everyone heard the parallels. Everyone connected the dots. And when court recessed for the day, something strange happened. No one stood up right away. They sat still, holding on to the words, the glances, the unfinished prayers. Even Diddy lingered. For the first time, he didn't rush out. He looked up at the ceiling, perhaps to the lights, or maybe to something higher. But everyone in that room understood something now. This wasn't just a trial about crimes. It was a trial about conscience, about how far a man could fall before the sound of his own heartbeat became the loudest testimony in the room. And the question hung there, unanswered. Had Diddy already confessed, just not in the way the court required? The courtroom doors hadn't even opened yet. And still, the sidewalk outside was full. Reporters whispered into cameras. Fans held signs, some praying, some accusing, and inside, the air itself was taut like a stretched wire waiting to snap. Everyone sensed something was shifting. The trial had peeled back layers. Fame, faith, money, but now it was moving toward the nucleus, silence, and the people who were paid to keep it. The prosecution's first witness of the day was someone who had long stayed in the shadows, a man whose name had never appeared in headlines, but whose work helped maintain the illusion of control. When he took the stand, no one expected the weight he carried to be so devastating. He introduced himself as Mason Cole, former private security driver, a contractor hired to transport. Diddy during high-profile or discreet meetings? The gallery barely reacted to his name. But by the end of his testimony, they'd never forget it. Mr. Cole, the prosecutor began. You worked closely with Mr. Combs during the months leading up to his arrest. Yes, Mason replied. Mostly late-night assignments. No questions asked. Describe one such night. There was a call around 3:11 a.m. Mr. Combs was panicked. Said he needed to get to Bishop Jake immediately. Told me not to use the usual route. We went through back roads. He didn't speak during the ride, just gripped a flash drive in his hand the entire time. Did he say anything upon arrival? He said, this is bigger than music. It's about eternity. Then he walked in alone. Did you see him afterward? Yes. 35 minutes later, he came out drenched in sweat, sat in the back seat and said, "If this doesn't save me, nothing will." The prosecutor continued, "Do you know what was on the flash drive?" "No, but he said something under his breath when he handed it over," he said. "They won't understand unless they hear me tell it. Has that flash drive been recovered?" "No, not to my knowledge." A fire lit behind the prosecutor's eyes, but he moved on. "Did Mr. Combs ever mention others being paid to stay silent?" "Yes, he called it protecting the kingdom. Said some things were better left sealed, not for his sake, but for God's." That line rippled through the courtroom. One juror blinked hard. Another scribbled something in the margin of their notes. The next witness was more volatile, a former bodyguard turned whistleblower. He wasn't quiet. He wasn't polite. He didn't come for peace. He testified that multiple individuals, assistants, stylists, even a videographer, were given spiritual directives not to speak, framed as protecting the anointing, but behind that language were contracts. And behind those contracts were payoffs. They made us think it was about God, he said. But it was about preservation of his image, his brand. And we all played along. Why are you speaking now? Because I watched many people break, cry, pray, leave that mansion, and disappear from themselves. And I stayed quiet because I was scared. The courtroom was dead still. Scared of what? He didn't blink. Scared that if I said the wrong thing, I'd end up forgotten or buried. The judge ordered the jury to disregard that last comment. But the jury had already heard it, and they wouldn't forget. Late in the day, it was confirmed through court records that Diddy's legal team had met privately with federal prosecutors the week before. The room buzzed. The phrase plea deal hovered in the area, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. When asked for comment, Diddy's lawyers only said, "All options remain on the table." Inside the courtroom, Diddy sat quietly, his eyes low, his hands clasped. He hadn't spoken publicly. He hadn't testified, but everything around him, every echo of every word, felt like it was closing in. The prosecutor ended the session with a single sentence. When a man builds an empire on silence, he must one day answer to the sound it makes when it breaks. Court recessed. Outside, the world waited. And inside, the jury prepared for what was next, because something was coming, and no one, not even Diddy, could stop it. Now, the judge ordered the courtroom doors closed. No one in or out. Phones already off. Media locked out. The gallery sat in eerie stillness. Diddy didn't move. His legal team didn't whisper. This wasn't just another day of witness testimony. This was the day they'd been waiting for, the turning point. The prosecution requested to enter a sealed audio recording into evidence. It had been recovered just days earlier, a single file extracted from an encrypted server during a federal raid. Confirmed authentic, voice matched, date stamped. The defense objected, of course, argued it was a violation of privacy. But the judge ruled it admissible. It wasn't an interview. It wasn't a confession to police. It was a voicemail from Diddy, left on Bishop T.D. Jake's private line. The room went dark as the court played the recording. A voice, familiar but cracked with wear, echoed through the speakers. Bishop. I don't know who else to talk to, man. I keep seeing their faces. I keep hearing their voices. I built all this to drown them out. The money, the lights, the applause. But none of it worked. The room was silent, except for the hum of the playback system. I lied. I manipulated. I used grace like a bulletproof vest. Told people I was saved, when really I was just hiding behind scripture I didn't even believe at the time. A sniffle. Then I told you I'd change. That I'd make things right, but I didn't. I just got better at looking holy. The jurors didn't look away. Even the stenographers stopped typing for a moment, eyes frozen on the speakers. There's a file. Diddy's voice continued. I left it in the safe at the studio. The one behind the third panel. It's everything. every deal, every voice, every receipt? I prayed no one would ever find ... double quotes gasps escaped the gallery. The judge struck his gavel twice. Order. The recording resumed. I'm tired, Bishop. I can't outrun this anymore. If they find that footage, I'm finished. But maybe I should be. Maybe that's the only real altar left. Double quotes click. Silence. The judge turned to the prosecution. Do you have that file? Yes, Your Honor. Executed under federal warrant. Contents confirmed: video, contracts, conversations, confidential settlement agreements, all tied to the defendant. The courtroom cracked like lightning. The defense looked paralyzed. One lawyer dropped his pen. Diddy stared forward as if he'd been waiting for this moment to arrive, and maybe, deep down, he had. The prosecution then submitted a second exhibit, a typed transcript of a letter sent from Diddy to Bishop Jake, dated 6 weeks before the trial began. It was short. Bishop, if I don't make it through this, please tell them I wasn't always a monster. Tell them I believed in redemption, even if I didn't earn it. I was more than the mask I wore. But maybe the mask fit better than my own skin. The judge called for a recess. He looked shaken, so did everyone else. As people filed out, they weren't just quiet, they were haunted. Because there it was, the truth, bleeding through the audio, not wrapped in spin or cleaned by legal teams, just a voice, raw and cornered. A man with everything admitting he had nothing left that could save him. Outside, news had already broken. The confession was being quoted. The video footage was being analyzed. Inside, the jury now had more than evidence. They had something heavier. The sound of a man finally stopping the performance. No more riddles, no more sermons. Just the silence that comes when the curtain finally falls. There was a stillness in the courtroom that didn't lift with the morning light. Reporters camped outside weren't asking if there would be a verdict soon. They were asking when. Inside, something had changed. After the voicemail and the file were introduced into evidence, there was a heaviness that wrapped around the proceedings like smoke. And then, unexpectedly, the defense declined to call Diddy to the stand. The judge asked again for confirmation. Diddy's lead attorney stood tall, looked directly at the bench, and said, "We rest our case." The room didn't gasp this time. It just sank. No final rebuttal, no last explanation, no personal plea. He had said what he needed to say through a voicemail never meant for a courtroom. So the defense pivoted. Their final move wasn't to clear Diddy's name, it was to soften it. They brought in one last witness, Dr. Naomi Teller, a psychologist specializing in religious trauma and emotional displacement. She walked in with a stack of notes and the calm of someone who'd walked through fires colder than this. Dr. Teller. The defense attorney began. "You've reviewed Mr. Combs's history, behavior, and the contents of his recorded statements." "I have. What's your conclusion?" Dr. Teller took her time. Sean Combs lived inside a spiritual conflict. What began as redemption turned into performance. He wore guilt the way others wear chains, visible only to those who know what guilt actually looks like. Are you saying he's mentally unfit? No, I'm saying he was emotionally fractured. He confused repentance with branding, and somewhere along the line, he convinced himself that confessing to a pastor was equal to answering to the law. The jury sat unmoving. The defense pressed on. So this voicemail, it wasn't strategy. No, it was surrender, but the kind of surrender that comes too late to undo damage. When the prosecution cross-examined, they didn't challenge the psychology. They embraced it. "So you agree," the prosecutor said, "that he knew what he was doing?" "Yes." "And that he feared the consequences deeply?" "Yes." "And that he tried to control the narrative even in his confessions?" "Yes." "Then it wasn't trauma that silenced the victims. It was him." The doctor hesitated. "I believe it was both. That duality, the man and the myth, the sinner and the strategist, hovered over the closing moments of testimony. And then came the sealed letter. It arrived through legal channels and was marked with the insignia of the Potter's house. Bishop T.D. Jakes was not present, but his presence had never left. The judge permitted a court officer to read the letter into the record. I have counseled men broken by law and men broken by shame. I do not claim to know what verdict should fall. I only know that a man who confesses in the dark must still face what's waiting in the light. May truth be served, and may mercy not be mistaken for permission. The courtroom didn't react loudly. It just absorbed every word. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, no one believed it would take long. The evidence was damning. The confession was real. And yet, there was complexity no one could ignore. Was he a manipulator of faith or a man drowning in it? In the final image of the day, Diddy sat alone at the defense table after everyone else had stood. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the crowd. He just closed his eyes, and for the first time, it didn't look like he was preparing a statement. It looked like he was waiting to be judged. It took 3 days. 72 hours of deliberation. The world outside the courthouse never slept. Reporters filed updates by the minute. Protesters and supporters clashed across barricades. Helicopters hovered overhead. Everyone was waiting not for a verdict, but for a sentence on what this man's legacy would be. Inside, the jury foreman stood. The judge asked if they'd reached a decision. He said yes, but not easily. In the gallery, the silence was more profound than prayer. Diddy didn't flinch. He looked ahead like a man who already knew what the answer would be. He hadn't changed clothes in 2 days. Just the same dark suit, same solemn expression, like his body was present, but his spirit had already wandered to some place no one else could reach. The clerk unfolded the paper, read aloud. On the count of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the count of conspiracy to intimidate witnesses, guilty. On the count of misuse of charitable funds, guilty. No cries, no shouting. Just the collective intake of breath from a room that had carried too much tension for too long. The judge asked the defendant to rise. Diddy, the judge said, "This court recognizes your right to remain silent, but you may speak before sentencing if you wish." Everyone watched him. And then he did something no one expected. He looked up. Really looked. He spoke. "I spent my life building a name, not a legacy. I bought silence with checks and guilt with prayers. I convinced myself if I knelt at the right altars, I'd never have to stand in a courtroom like this. But here I am." He turned slightly toward the jury. "I don't ask for mercy. I ask that you remember the people who were quiet because of me. And if I told you I was sorry, it wouldn't be enough. I know that now. That's the thing about truth, it doesn't care how expensive your apology is." He sat back down. The judge delivered the sentence, 15 years. Not the maximum, but enough to erase the myth. Enough to start the slow dismantling of a once untouchable icon. As the gavel struck, the room didn't erupt. It exhaled. Outside, people cried. Others cheered. Some just stared at the building, waiting for a sign that something had changed. A man had fallen. But so had the illusion of invincibility. Later that day, a statement was read in the hallway to a crowd of microphones from Bishop T.D. Jakes. "I offer no defense for Mr. Combs. That's not my calling. I offer only this. May all of us confront the quiet places in our hearts where we believe power can excuse pain. And may the truth, however late it arrives, never be turned away." That night, the courtroom was empty, the chairs stacked, the sketches boxed, but something lingered in the wood, in the marble, in the echo of footsteps. It wasn't just the ghost of a verdict. It was the sound of someone finally facing everything they thought they could outrun, and it was deafening.